Chapter 1. The Myth Breaks, the Reality of the Northmen. Imagine, it is winter in the 8th century in the north. The sun barely rises above the horizon, and the cold bites into the bones. In a small settlement on a Norwegian fjord or a Danish peninsula, a fire burns in the center of a longhouse. Smoke rises through the hole in the roof, mixing with the smell of damp wood, sheep's wool, and baked rye bread. There live no wild warriors waiting only for the next raid. There dwell people whose hands are cracked from the plow, whose backs are bent from labor on the land. Before they became Vikings, they were farmers, and before we plunge into the world of the Vikings, we must bury a myth, the horned helmets. There is no historical artifact from the Scandinavian Iron Age that proves warriors wore horned helmets. This image is an invention of the 19th century, shaped by opera composers such as Richard Wagner and painters who envisioned an exotic, dramatic North. In reality, a helmet with horns would have been lethal on the battlefield. Opponents could have grabbed hold of them to topple or suffocate the wearer. The Scandinavians of the early Middle Ages were pragmatic. If they wore a helmet, it was made of iron or leather, smooth and functional. But most of them wore no helmet at all. They wore a cap made of wool or fur to protect themselves from the cold. To truly understand the daily lives of these people, we must detach ourselves from the image of the Viking and instead immerse ourselves in the heart of a farmstead. Life in Scandinavia before 793, the date of the first major raid on Lindisfarne, often regarded as the beginning of the Viking Age, was characterized by a harsh struggle against an unforgiving nature. The soils were often poor and the growing seasons short. To own arable land did not mean wealth in the modern sense, but rather the survival of the family. The center of life was the gard, the farmstead. It typically consisted of a long house, a long hall built of timber and wattle and daub, where people and animals lived under one roof. This was not a matter of hygiene as we understand it today, but a necessity for retaining warmth during winter. The heat generated by cattle and sheep helped to ward off the cold. Life within this house followed a strict rhythm. The day began with the first light, or often even before. There were no holidays on which work could be avoided, unless the weather was too severe. The men were responsible for the heavy farming work. Plowing was one of the most important activities of the year. Using a wooden plow, whose iron coulter often came from trade or was laboriously forged, they had to break up the hard earth. Oxen were often used as draft animals, as horses were too valuable and used for transport. A man had to know when to sow so that the rye would ripen before the first frost. He also had to fell wood for repairs, build fences, and maintain the paths. But it would be a mistake to believe that this was purely men's work. Women were the backbone of the household. Without their labor, the farm would have collapsed within a few years. They tended the garden, where vegetables such as cabbage, peas, or turnips grew. They looked after the poultry and collected the eggs. However, their most important task was spinning and weaving. Wool was shorn from the sheep, washed, combed, and spun. On the loom, cloth was produced for clothing, blankets, and even for trade. A well-made fabric was as valuable as gold. Women often managed the household stores too, overseeing the grain in the troughs and the beer brewed from malt. They were the managers of daily survival. The diet was simple but nourishing. Meat was not eaten every day. It was a festive dish or came from animals that were no longer fit for work. Daily life consisted of porridge, bread, dairy products such as cheese and butter, and fish caught in coastal areas. Beer was the most important drink, as water could often be contaminated. The beer was less strong than it is today, but it provided calories and hydration. Society in this period was not characterized by a rigid hierarchy like the later feudalism, but by a network of kinship and neighborhood. The most important place of community was the Thing. This was no assembly of warrior kings, but a day in court for the free population. Several times a year, men from the surrounding area would meet at a designated spot, often on a hill or in a level area with good ground. There, disputes were settled, laws proclaimed, and decisions made. He who had the floor was not always the strongest, but often the one who knew and was respected for knowing the traditions. There was a law speaker who knew the laws by heart. This shows that law and order were just as important to these people as war. But why did they become Vikings? Why did they leave their farms to sail to foreign lands? The answer lies not in a sudden thirst for blood, but in economic pressure. The climate shifted slightly, the population grew, and available arable land became scarce. Moreover, there was strong trade with the rest of Europe. Scandinavians traded furs, amber and iron for luxury goods such as silk, glass, and silver from Byzantium or the Arab world. They had known navigation long before the raids. Their longships were masterpieces of technology, built for shallow waters and coastal sailing expeditions. Religion played a role in daily life, but it was less dogmatic than Christianity would later become. Gods such as Odin or Thor were not merely war deities, they were also protectors of agriculture and the family. Freya represented fertility. People did not make sacrifices to frighten the heavens, but to appease nature. A blot, a sacrificial feast, was often a community event at which meat was shared. It was about maintaining the balance between humanity and the environment. If the harvest failed, they did not look for a scapegoat, but asked themselves whether the rituals had been followed correctly. It is important to understand that the transition from farmer to Viking was fluid. A man might plow his fields in spring and set sail for England in autumn on the same ship, to engage in trade or, if circumstances demanded, to raid. The weapons they used were often also tools. An axe was a tool for chopping wood and a weapon for combat. A sword was expensive and a status symbol that one did not lose carelessly. The Scandinavians of this time were therefore not barbarians in the sense of uncivilized savages. They possessed a complex social structure, craftsmanship of a high standard, and a profound understanding of their environment. They were masters of adaptability. When the land could no longer support them, they sought new paths. When trade was blocked, they took what they needed. Yet the foundation of their identity remained the farm, the family, and the work on the land. When we look at old runestones today, or at the remnants of longhouses in museums, we should not only think of swords. We should think of the smell of damp hay, the humming of the loom, and the weary hands of a man coming to rest after a long day in the fields. The legend of the Viking with a horned helmet is a romantic fiction, created in an era when Europe was seeking to reinvent itself. The truth is far more fascinating. They were hardy, diligent people who battled the wind and the cold to feed their families. Their legacy is not only the gold they buried in monasteries, but also the settlements they established, the language they brought with them, and the seafaring techniques that revolutionized European trade. Before they struck fear into the world, they built their own world. They were farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. It was only when these roles were no longer sufficient to secure their survival that they became Vikings. At the end of the day, when the fire in the longhouse had burnt down and the stars shone over the fjord, a Scandinavian of that time's primary concern was not the next victory on the battlefield. It was the question, will winter come? Do we have enough stores? Is the livestock healthy? These worries drove them more than any glory. They were the architects of their own existence, shaped by ice and earth, long before they wrote European history with fire and sword. And in this quietude of everyday life, perhaps lies their true greatness. The ability not only to survive in the most inhospitable land in the world, but to create a culture that resonates to this day.